And what I mean by that is that things like cycling, assault bike, etc., they're all primarily concentric activities because you're doing the shortening phase, but you don't have a lot of force to absorb on impact or on the lengthening phase. Whereas with running, if you're doing hard sprints, that's super fatiguing. And if you're doing a 20-minute sprint session, especially if you're not an athlete who has trained sprints before, you're going to be so sore, probably even sore than you will be after your leg sessions. So choosing those concentric activities where possible would be my advice.
Yeah, because you kind of do forget that one of the functions of muscles is to absorb like the
Yeah,
shock, or whatever you want to call it, the forces that your body is
yeah,
exposed to. And so like, and you definitely notice this if you try to run downhill, like your quads are gonna be fucking beat the fuck up the
yeah.
next day, because they're absorbing all that braking force,
And it actually feels easy at the time. That's the thing with downhill, especially. And then the day after, you just goosed.
Yeah, you're just like, fuck, I didn't realize my quad could feel like this. Like, you're like, I thought I trained my legs, I thought I, trained hard, right? So that is something to be aware of. But also, like, it is one of those things where it's kind of hard to really say, because there's actually mixed research on this in terms of what is more fatiguing. And it probably comes down to your actual background and, different things. For example, a few like research papers have shown that cycling is actually more fatiguing than running, right? And the reason is this is probably because people cycling pushed harder, because it's actually way easier to push hard while cycling, because for the exact same reason that Gary's talking about there is you only kind of have to do half the work. You're only kind of doing the concentric bit. You're not really doing the eccentric. Now I know, like, actual cyclists will kind of cringe at that, because
Yeah.
they don't just push down while they're doing the work. Like, they're actually pulling up with the opposite leg. Like, if you ever go on one of those like spin bikes, can't remember the name of them, but like this kind of spin bikes that have like the
Pedals.
ratio of how to you
Oh,
push
yeah.
each of those things. Like, it'll show you the kind of map. Like, it'll show how much like pushing force you're doing and how much pulling force you're doing, and the ratio between the two legs there. So that is something to be aware of, that like, it depends on your background what's going to be more fatiguing. Like, if you're a competitive cyclist and you're like, okay, actually I use the pull on the bike as well, like I'm actually using my hamstring, etc., that's probably going to be a bit more fatiguing than someone who's just like pushing
Yeah.
down and letting the effectively the momentum carry the leg back up, right? So that is something to be aware of. Obviously it depends on what you have been doing, what you're adapted to, etc., etc., right? But yeah, so that's kind of how we would integrate it. It's pretty straightforward. Now, me personally, I kind of like just maximize the time interval that we're doing, in terms of, look, if we got 10 minutes to do cardio at the end of our training, like, I want to make that as intense as
Mhm.
possible, in terms of like the same way you would do with your resistance training. Like, let's say we have 3 sets to do in that 10 minutes. I want to make those 3 sets, hard, for the 30 seconds or whatever we're doing, before we start just adding more volume. Because you wouldn't do that with your training volume, like we've discussed. You wouldn't just go, oh yeah, I did kind of 3 sloppy sets and like my performance was definitely decreased by the third set. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to add another set. You wouldn't do that. You'd go, okay, let's actually maximize the 3 sets first before we start adding more, right? So that's the way you should also be thinking about this.